Hi, I'm Arun George, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In today's episode, we're taking a look at the latest point of friction between India and China. We're also talking about the rebuilding of what is one of India's most iconic areas and why it's raising questions. But first, we're taking a quick look at a court's verdict in the Babri Masjid demolition case. Almost 28 years after the Babri Masjid was demolished in Ayodhya, a special CBI court in Lucknow acquitted all 32 accused of conspiring to carry out the demolition. The list of the accused includes former Deputy Prime Minister Lal Krishna Advani. The court held that the demolition of the 500-year-old Babri Masjid wasn't planned and there was a lack of evidence against the accused. 26 of the 32 accused were present in the special court when the judgment was pronounced. L.K. Advani, Murli Manohar Joshi, Uma Bharti, Satish Pradhan, and Kalyan Singh were among those who excused themselves from appearing on the grounds of health and age. The Babri Masjid was demolished on the 6th of December 1992 by Kar Sevaks who claimed that it was built on the site of an ancient Ram temple. The demolition sparked riots in many parts of the country that left nearly 2,000 dead. Two cases were filed in Ayodhya. One related to the conspiracy regarding the demolition and another about the instigation of the crowd. The remaining FIRs were merged with the FIR related to the conspiracy. The CBI had filed a charge sheet against 49 people in the case, of which 17 died during the course of the trial. The court recorded the statements of 351 witnesses. This verdict comes a year after the Supreme Court held that the demolition of the mosque was a violation of law, but held that a Ram temple could be constructed at the site. Earlier this year, the foundation stone was laid for the construction of the Ram temple. Many BJP leaders hailed the CBI court's verdict as proof that the case was a politically motivated one. Following his acquittal, Advani issued a statement in which he said that he wholeheartedly welcomed the judgment and that it vindicated his personal and the BJP's belief and commitment towards the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. Advani said that it was a historic decision by the court and it proved that no conspiracy was hatched for the 6th of December incident in Ayodhya. He also issued a video statement in which he said how he'd responded to the verdict.
जब ये समाचार सुना, जय श्री राम कह करके हमने इसका स्वागत किया.
On Tuesday, China's foreign ministry spokesperson said that China does not recognize the so-called Union Territory of Ladakh in India and opposes the infrastructure construction in disputed border areas for military control purposes. In a separate statement, China told an Indian publication that it abides by the line of control as proposed by its Premier Zhou Enlai to Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru in a letter dated the 7th of November 1959. Both statements come as a surprise given the efforts between India and China to dial down tensions following months of troop buildup along the border. But what is this 1959 line of actual control? And what is India's stance on it? And does this rhetoric set back talks between the two nations? To answer these questions and more, we spoke with Shubhajit Roy, the Indian Express's associate editor covering foreign affairs. Shubhajit, has China ever spoken up against the creation of the Union Territory of Ladakh before? And what does it mean if China doesn't recognize this Union Territory?
China had spoken about the Union Territory of Ladakh after last year's 5th August abrogation of Article 370 and bifurcation of the state into two union territories. At that point of time, the Chinese side had objected to the formation of Ladakh as union territory, saying that it undermines China's territorial sovereignty. And at that point of time, China had also expressed serious concern about the situation in the region and had said that relevant sides need to exercise restraint and act prudently. Now, this time, when they said that it does not recognize the so-called Union Territory of Ladakh, that is being seen as an escalation of the public rhetoric. Because India obviously rejects these comments, because last year, when the Chinese side had said that it undermines China's territorial sovereignty, the Indian side had responded saying that China doesn't have any locus standi. And if you remember, in August last year, the External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, he had in fact flown down to Beijing and had met the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, and had explained to him that the Indian move of abrogation of Article 370 and bifurcation of the state into two union territories is an internal administrative move, which does not mean that India has changed the borders or changed the alignment. India's claim lines are the same as before. So there's no material difference in India's claim as far as the border dispute is concerned. So that's why this particular time when the Chinese Foreign Ministry said this on Tuesday, this came as a new element in terms of a public rhetoric. Having said that, the Indian side obviously rejected this particular thing. And there was also a statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry saying they invoked the 1959 line of actual control, which obviously Indian side again said that India never accepts the so-called unilaterally defined 1959 LSC and said that it is untenable. So essentially, if you see the public statements coming out from Beijing and the response that India is giving, it is again an escalation of public rhetoric, as we see after almost 3 weeks of the foreign ministers meeting in Moscow.
So you mentioned this, but China has, as you said, like China has already said that it kind of abides by the line of actual control as proposed all the way back in 1959. Could you explain what was proposed in 1959 and why India has objected to this?
So China in November 1959 had proposed a line of actual control, which is much ahead of where the Indian side believes the border should be and border is. So it was part of then Chinese Premier Chou En-lai's letter to Indian Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. And in that letter, that particular claim line was advanced, which was obviously not acceptable to Nehru back then. And the Indian government has consistently taken the position that that is not the line that Indian side accepts. In fact, that line itself was the bone of contention, and that led to the war in 1962. And ever since the engagement took place in the last 3 decades between India and China, since 1988, and all the agreements since 1993, which have been signed between India and China, they don't deliberately mention the 1959 LSC because that is not acceptable to India. So it was widely understood that the Indian side does not accept that particular Chinese claim line, and therefore there is no reason why it should be included in a bilateral document. Now, with China sort of pushing that old claim line, is again pushing what it has always claimed in its diplomatic conversations, because it maintains that that claim line is where the border should be. So this particular statement actually turns the clock backwards, and we are again back where it led to the situation, the tension, and led to the 1962 war.
Then what is India's stance on the line of actual control vis-a-vis this 1959 agreement? We are saying basically that its base is now the agreements that were signed subsequently, as you said, post 1989.
Yeah. So post 88, there were few agreements to maintain the peace along the border. So those agreements don't make a mention of the 1959 LSC. In fact, that's why India says that things are untenable, and India has never accepted that statement. Now, India also says that the two sides should engage in an exercise to clarify and confirm the LSC up to 2003. But this process could not proceed as the Chinese side has not shown a willingness to pursue this. And this was said yesterday by the MEA spokesperson, putting the onus on Beijing to clarify the LSC. So now the Indian side says that it has always respected and abided by the LSC, and pushing a claim line which is unilateral, which is only accepted by the Chinese side, does not help matters. Instead of dialing down the tensions, it actually ratchets up the tension.
I mean, you mentioned this ratcheting up of tensions, and that is the next question really. How much does this affect the current situation that China and India have kind of worked to get to, where they've agreed to de-escalate along the border? And how much does this kind of public rhetoric kind of stir that up?
So the public rhetoric obviously gets stirred up with such comments. But, if we look at it very sort of in a cold, calculated manner, after the 10th of September meeting between the foreign ministers of India and China in Moscow, where they decided that they should not escalate the situation at the ground level, there has been no escalation so far. So it is as is, where is basis. The troops are still eyeball to eyeball, are within firing range of each other, but there has been no escalation, which is a good sign. But having said that, there's been no de-escalation either. And the trust deficit is pretty high. So the Indian side has maintained that if the non-escalatory behavior continues for a considerable period of time, then they can move towards de-escalation. As of now, as on Wednesday, the diplomats from both sides met through virtual mode under the rubric of WMCC, which is the topmost diplomatic body, which is the working mechanism for consultation and coordination on India-China border affairs. And they essentially reiterated that the two sides should avoid misunderstandings and maintain stability on the ground. And their statements were again called for the next round of meeting of the senior commanders, military commanders, so that both sides can work towards early and complete disengagement of the troops. So this essentially position was reiterated again. And now efforts are again on to de-escalate. But as of now, because of the tone and tenor of the rhetoric, the public rhetoric that we have seen from the Chinese Foreign Ministry and the Indian response, it looks as if the two sides are in for a long haul and both sides have dug in their heels. And the chances of disengagement in immediate future, near future, is really slim.
So, given this raising of stakes came like a bit of a bolt from the blue, what will we be watching for in the coming days now?
The next step after the WMCC meeting now, as that is taking place, there should be the core commanders meeting. But before that, the Indian side would watch whether the Chinese side is escalating or engaging in any escalatory behavior. If the Chinese side indulges in some kind of escalatory behavior, and if the Indian side also has to respond to that to match that particular provocative action, so then again we will see escalation. The key thing is to maintain the status quo, maintain the non-escalatory behavior, and then move towards status quo ante, which is going back to the April positions. And for that to happen, there has to be serious intent to de-escalate and disengage.
Before we get to the next segment, I just wanted your quick attention. One of the big reasons people say that they like this show is because it helps them understand the news better. It provides them with the context they need to see the bigger picture. And there's perhaps no other place that does this better than the Indian Express's Explained section. We on Three Things refer to the section regularly, and it helps us make this show. If you're a regular reader of the newspaper, you know how useful the Explained section can be, especially when you're looking for in-depth analysis by the right experts. You can log into indianexpress.com/explained and access their coverage 24/7. Explained by the Indian Express, where news that matters is explained by experts who know the subject. Now, back to the show. If you stand at the India Gate on a clear day, you can see all the way to the President's residence, Rashtrapati Bhavan, and the North and South Block. If you drive, cycle, or walk down Rajpath, you'd be walking by lawns that have a thicket of trees at the edge. You can see the tops of buildings as you go down the 3-kilometer stretch of Rajpath. But unless you know what you're looking for, it's unlikely you know which buildings you're looking at. When you get near Raisina Hill and the North and South Block buildings, you get a glimpse of the Grand Parliament House. In the morning, you find cyclists, runners, and families who've traveled to Rajpath in cars. Late in the day, this area is largely filled with vehicles and office goers, mostly government employees. In the evening, a pre-COVID Rajpath would be crowded with tourists and local residents enjoying the open lawns. But how you see one of India's most iconic roads is set to change, with the government pushing ahead with its massive project that could cost upward of 12,000 crore rupees. On the 17th of September, Tata Projects Limited won the bid to build India's new Parliament building in the next 21 months. This is one of the most visible constructions as part of the Central Vista redevelopment project being undertaken by the government. This project is intended to be completed by 2024, the year the country will have its next national elections. So what is the Central Vista?
It's really this ensemble of buildings. So you have the main access, which is the Rajpath, and it goes all the way from the Rashtrapati Bhavan all the way down to India Gate or Princess Park, as you call it. So Lutyens built what we know as the Viceroy's Palace or Rashtrapati Bhavan, and Baker built the North and South blocks. And alongside, down the line, we have all the other palaces, so to speak. At that time, it was Baroda House, it was Hyderabad House, the Patiala House, all that, which is now transformed. Like the Baroda House is now the Northern Railway quarters. You have the Jaipur House, which is now the NGMA. You have the Patiala House, which has become our courts. You have Bikaner House, extra. So all the bhavans that have come alongside now, which is more post-independence, that is primarily where our history and where the Central Vista is located, so to speak, as a kind of a cut away from what we know as the old city of Delhi, as we know as a place of rebellion, to become the state of power, and literally where our democracy sits today.
That's Shaini Varghese, who writes on architecture and urban planning for the Indian Express and has written extensively on the Central Vista redevelopment project. Shaini says that what is now known as the Central Vista was developed by the British when they shifted the capital of India from Calcutta to Delhi. Shaini says that from being known as a city that was defined by the narrow lanes of Shah Jahanabad, planners Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker transformed a portion of Delhi into a city with monuments, sprawling lawns, and broad roads. So how is it going to change now?
When it was initially floated, this idea of the redevelopment of the Central Vista, when it was initially floated in September 2019, the idea was, at that point, it only said the redevelopment of Central Vista. It did not kind of give any further information in terms of what it's going to be, or rather what that is going to mean. Today, we know that it will mean a new parliament. It will mean that all the bhavans along that side, so there's Shastri Bhavan, Udyog Bhavan, all those bhavans are going to go, they're going to be demolished, and new buildings are going to come up. And even the IGNCA, which is not very old, which is like, I think it's somewhere in the 80s, 87 or something, where IGNCA kind of came together as a complex where people could go to. All those buildings are going to be revamped, and probably many of the buildings are going to be demolished.
Shaini also says that we will see a reduction in public space for people and a lot of new government buildings that will be more fortress-like.
We're going to have a lot less space for us to protest, to go for ice creams, or just to walk around.
Gujarat-based HCP Design Planning and Management, headed by architect Bimal Patel, won the consultancy bid for architectural and engineering planning for the project in 2019. But there have been multiple objections raised, with other architects crying foul over how the project was awarded.
The objections have been fourfold, because you're looking at the environmental aspects of it, you're looking at the heritage or the built space, because end of the day, it's not 100 years yet, but it's almost there. You're looking at the social aspect of it, and of course, largely you're looking at the financial aspect of it. So there are four primary heads under which I would say objections are. So for instance, in the heritage or the built space aspect of it, the idea that you're going to concentrate all your government offices in the Central Vista goes completely against what the master plan of 2021 had actually suggested, which was to decongest the capital. This happened even before we were in a COVID situation. So today, when you're arguing that, can't we become more digital and can't we become more efficient in the way that we use space, this is one big thing that the architects and planners were discussing, that why do we need to concentrate and congest the capital again with all these buildings that are going to come up? And of course, the land use will change, which was earlier, a lot of it was recreational, because you have places like the IGNCA, which was completely public. And that's going to be an office space for the government, which means it's going to be out of bounds for you and me. The environment clearance, that there's been no environmental impact assessment that's done. For the heritage, while they're saying it is prone to earthquakes and all that, there has been no assessment of that done. There's been no justification of why this project should happen in the first place. Of course, we are all aware that the place needs renovation, no doubt. If you have the roof falling on your head, if you have electric circuits, which have happened in the past, then there should certainly be some kind of a whole assessment of it done to know how much and what those details are. So there's no detailed project report. And if you look at the financial aspect of it, the initial project document had no information about what kind of money is going to be spent.
Shaini says that a major issue with the project is the fact that it affects the public space available to regular people.
You're taking away public space without so much as any kind of a discussion with the public. Many parliamentarians themselves didn't know that a project like this was even proposed or even planned. So the question then is, where is the transparency, and how do you take public money, use it for a public project, and not inform the public about it. I remember one architect saying that, if you look at the plan, so he had clearly studied the plan very closely because at that time it wasn't out in the public domain. But he said that 80 acres of the land, which is public use, will now be shrunk and we'll probably get only 9 acres. So if you're talking about 80 acres of land that's going to go, which was earlier open to public, how are we justifying it as a project for people?
There have been several objections raised to this project. One of them has come from retired bureaucrats. Political parties have also cried foul over the money being spent on the project, despite MPs not getting local area development funds for 2 years. However, the government countered objections, saying that many of the buildings like Parliament Building were too old to meet future and even existing requirements. We are shiny about this. One could argue, as you said, that this is an old design and needs to be updated, especially if there's a sort of failure of the structure itself. So what's the issue with, demolishing and rebuilding? One could argue that you could do it all in one go and therefore, it provides economies of scale, saving more time and money effectively. What's the flaw with this argument?
There isn't actually. So there are two ways that you can argue this. One is to say that, okay, yes, certain buildings do need repair and they do need to be brought down because according to you, they are ugly buildings. Okay, because that's why they don't serve the purpose and they're ugly buildings. Therefore, we'll make something new for you. So in one way, it is the sense of obsolescence that you think is primary to architecture. That is what has always happened. So you're trying to say that this old set of values that you had, that is all humbug. We are going to present a new set of values to you. So in doing that, what you're doing is also kind of destroying, what was primarily a way that we saw ourselves in history at that point. These buildings that are going to be destroyed, all these bhavans, were seen as building. Okay, so they were done by the CPWD engineers primarily. This was by which time the British had left. So these were our most indigenous way that we had built, a very government way that we had built, where the architects really didn't step in. They were still done by the engineers. So you're kind of erasing that whole sense of what self-reliance and this Atmanirbhar concept is, that at a particular point in time, you're of course erasing that. It is not just about, bringing down a building. It is bringing down those values. It is bringing down what we should be as a state. As somebody had said, that how should the state look? In today's day, that's a very important question. So that is what I'm curious about, to know what were the questions that prompted this project in the first place. What were the questions they were asking themselves? Were they asking, how are we going to look as a state? How are we going to look to the world? How are we going to look to our own people? And we all know what those answers are today in the way that they have gone about doing the project.
So what really are the solutions to such scenarios, where you have this historic area, but at the same time you have the government institutions in there that need some sort of upgradation?
The solution really is to go to the people themselves, I think, and to kind of find out what do they need. In a world that is primarily moving towards digital, are there other ways that these spaces can be opened up? In making this place a lot more alien to public, what they are primarily doing is taking away the power that people have. So if you're saying that, okay, this building is leaking and we need space, if you go to any architect, we all live in homes where there is always a drainage problem, there is always a leak, there is always something else. None of us really break down our buildings to redo. And this is done with our own money, like the money I have in my pocket. It is usually done as okay, we will just do waterproofing here for now and we will handle this for now. The point is that we have to be responsible for the money we have been given. We are talking about a country which is, of course, let's not get into GDP and, where our economy lies, but we're primarily talking about a country which is not a very rich country. So if you have to be careful about the way that people's money is going to be utilized, how best and how efficiently can you use it is the question.
But why does it matter how this area is developed?
There was a huge population of people who came with their families. And these are people who are either migrant laborers who have possibly small units of homes, not bigger than 3 feet by 7 feet kind of spaces. the India Gate lawns, the whole Central Vista was a place where they could come in the evenings. The offices are shut. They could come in the evenings, stroll around. It became their avenue of just being able to have that leisure space. It became a place for anybody to come in without having to pay an entry ticket, without having to say that, oh, should I be dressed in a certain way? It was a truly democratic, equitable space. It also came with a certain sense of memory. So everybody whom you speak to says, oh, when I was a child, we would go there often to have ice cream. What has now become the National War Memorial was also a children's park, which has now been turned into this, gated kind of a public space. So when we're talking about its significance, it is not about, just that it's about the buildings. It is really about what that social equitability is.
Shiny says after the redevelopment, Rajpath will be lined with high buildings that have huge stone facades.
So imagine going down Rajpath with these huge 40-meter tall buildings on either side of you. If it's not going to be a fortress, what is it going to be?
However, Shiny says that this approach is something that India's traditionally taken towards urban planning, a top-down approach where things are said to be corrected. Shiny says that cities are often places in transition, constantly undergoing minor changes with reuse and modifications. So what happens with this sort of complete erasure and rewriting of architectural history? And what are the risks of doing that?
You're going to numb people's senses towards you as a government, and you're going to have huge trust deficits. End of the day, architecture is really about state setting. It is presenting to the people that, look, this is what we have to show. Like Churchill had said this, first you shape the building and then the building shapes you.
You were listening to The Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Arun George, and as always, was edited and mixed by our producer, Joshua Thomas. Before we go, here's another reminder to check out Indian Express's Explained page. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explained and find in-depth analysis by the right experts. It has everything you need to know to understand the news better and see the bigger picture. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.